Yeah, we got a lot to cover. So first and foremost, a huge thank you to everyone joining us tonight. Jim, thank you, and Isaiah, thank you. We'll introduce you in a second. So welcome to our annual State of Admissions. Maybe a few weeks ago, you joined us for the early State of Admissions webinar that we did. But now this is it. All the decisions are in, right? As of so April 1st, right? Not counting waitlists, we'll get there shortly. But all the decisions are in, and this is what Jim and I do every year, right? We sit down with all of you and we have a conversation about what are the trends in college admissions? What have we seen? And I want to actually open by sharing a text message I got the other day when I was talking with people that we were doing this and all excited. And they said, "Hi, Eric. I'll be sure to pass the event along," which we always appreciate, by the way, guys. This event is being recorded tonight. Feel free to send the link out to anyone and everyone you want. I started this business 15 years ago with our co-founder, Karan Shah. It's actually our 15-year anniversary this year, which is really exciting. Stay tuned in the coming weeks for more details on that and celebration. But we've grown exclusively by word of mouth referrals. So all of your support is appreciated. So this person says, "Hi, Eric, I'll be sure to pass the event along. Here's to staying relevant in the fast changing times. I feel like even in my short span of my kids applying to colleges, the landscape has changed so much. I can't imagine it from your perspective." And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to share our perspective. And I do think it's worth saying that even after 15 years of this, my default and authentically, my authentic answer when people ask about the changes, I say, look, the more things change, in many ways, the more they stay the same, right? In 15 years, and we're not going to recap this because this is what we talk about in so many of our webinars. In 15 years, it's the same five things that are in your control, right? Everything else is out of your control, but it's grades and rigor, standardized tests, activities, recommendation letters, and essays and applications. Those are the five things in your control, right? That's what we've designed our company and our services, to support students around. Um, you know, we're here tonight, though, to obviously talk about what are the differences. What are the things we've observed in the past year? Um, so with that said, I'm going to introduce myself, then Jim, I'm going to introduce Isaiah, and we're going to launch into all the things we observed this past year. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Carlin. I'm one of the co-founders of Ivy Experience, started back in 2010. Uh, we started as a small mom and pop shop in the greater Philadelphia area. As I was just talking about, word of mouth is a great thing. We've now worked with students in more than 40 states and 20 countries, be accepted to more than 500 universities all around the world, including USC, Isaiah, including USC, a few every year. Um, and it's been a great journey. While my heart is in Philly and rooting for the Phillies and Eagles, and sadly the Sixers and Flyers too, these days. Maybe I should be a Kraken fan, Isaiah. Lived in San Diego for a bit, and then my wife and two daughters and I live in South Florida, and excited to be here tonight. So, Jim?
My name's Jim Wismer, Philadelphia born and bred with a few other stops along the way. I am very excited to be here. I'm the director of Ivy Experience, so I oversee our test prep and tutoring of all kinds for school subjects, AP exams, SAT and ACT prep. And I also work a lot with our families on advising around test optional admissions policies, whether they work with us on the test prep side of things or working with us on their essays and applications. And Isaiah, why don't you go next?
Yeah, my name's Isaiah Steed. I'm currently a senior assistant director of admission at the University of Southern California. I had to think recently, wow, I am completing my eighth cycle in admission. I've been in the kind of higher ed, higher ed adjacent recruitment sphere for around 9 years. So I bring experience at USC, large private research. I previously worked at Whittier College, small liberal arts in Whittier, California. I consider myself to be a higher education professional and really value getting the information to students that will best prepare them for whatever that next step might be. So I also picked up a master's degree in school counseling to get kind of both sides of the coin in terms of developing the skills to help students in that process. And I think skills have really helped me out on this side of the desk and see where they'll take me from here. Happy to be here tonight,
Awesome.
and thank you both, Jim and Eric, for having me.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you. Now, our regular webinar attendees have heard from me and Eric plenty. So to help them get to know you a little bit, Isaiah, I have a bit of an icebreaker question for you. So I want to ask you, Isaiah, not Isaiah, the Senior Director of Admissions at USC, but Isaiah Sneed, human being who has read thousands of college applications, counseled families, worked on the higher ed side. What is your number one piece of advice to students and families in this entire getting ready for and applying to college process?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. And I think it may come as a surprise. I would say my biggest piece of advice is likely advice that you have heard over and over again, but I want you to take a second to really think through what the meaning behind the advice is, right? So I imagine most of you have heard before, just be yourself in this college application process, right? The most important thing is to be genuine. And really kind of what we're asking students and families to do when we say, be yourself, is to really take the time to reflect on who you are at this point. What the values are, the experiences are, the people that you grew up around, the characteristics, those kind of core things that make you who you are. Take the time to determine what those are and then use the application as the opportunity to explain those to the reader so that the reader walks away with a very good understanding of who you are. It's not easy to do. That's really hard. And it's actually something that most people will continue to do through their life. So it's almost a learning experience, right? The opportunity for you to figure out what self-reflection is for you, what that process look like for you, and kind of start flexing that muscle of self-reflection and articulating some of those kind of more difficult questions of being a human, right? For the reader. Why that's important is because, I think sometimes we think that in admission, we are just looking for students who have the best grades, right? And in actuality, that is still important, but hear me out. We're really looking for students that are going to continue to make our university what it is and even better, right? So we want students that come to, let's say USC, but I'm going to apply this to most universities, that people are excited to be in a group with. When you're with that person over there, the other students should be like, yes, I got that guy or that person, whatever that might be, right? Students that professors are excited to teach, right? And so when you're, able to really kind of explain those things that make you an excited student to teach, and you're able to do that in a way that is genuine, that really just translates best to the reader in the application. So again, I think just adding that why to it is important because you will continue to hear that. Be yourself, and just know that it takes time. Take that time, sit in that discomfort, understand we don't write like that a lot, and that's okay, but this is practice for skills that we can for you long term. And then when you find it, let that translate to the page. Tell that story, tell your story. And know, again, when you hear that, the why behind it.
Isaiah, we candidly, Jim and I were, excuse me, we were reading some things on your USC bio earlier, and one of them was admission advice, and it's funny because spoke with a couple senior families today who are making the decision very soon by May 1st of where they want to commit to, but I think that this wisdom would be invaluable to our juniors and sophomore and even freshman families who are with us tonight, who are navigating the process. You would, what I thought was really cool wisdom. You said, choose a college where you're going to do your best work, and go to a school where walking on the campus feels like walking into your cousin's house or your best friend's house. And before we go on to the trends and new perspectives, I was just wondering if you want to elaborate on that, because I thought that was really cool insight.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I think a lot of families will hear about is like fit. Um, and I think, when we hear things so often, we forget to really think about what they mean. So when I say, choose an institution where you feel like you're going to your cousin's or your best friend's house, I'm really talking about fit. And we all kind of know what that feeling is like when you maybe go to someone's house and you're maybe a little bit uncomfortable and you're kind of like, "Ooh, I'm just gonna, I don't know, be quiet. I'm not even gonna ask for a glass of water. I'm just nervous, right? Um, and then in the inverse, right? We know when you go to your cousin's house and you maybe say hello to their mother and like give them a hug and you're like, oh, go in the fridge. Like that feeling is that feeling of like, oh, I'm comfortable here. And so when we're talking about choosing a school where you're going to do your best work, that's the most important thing. You're not going to do your best work unless you're in a place that you feel comfortable. A school can have, okay.
No, I was going to say, what are ways that you would advise when students are researching colleges or even visiting colleges to sense that comfort?
Yeah. I think I think when you're talking to the people on the campus, being conscious of just how you feel intimidated, do you feel nervous, or do you feel like they're approaching you with kind of that warmth that you would associate with, right? Saying your best friend or your cousin or whatnot, right? Because again, that translates directly to the classroom. If you don't feel like you can go talk to your professor, then it really doesn't matter that they've done all these different things, right? So it's paying attention to even how colleges present themselves and how or what type of environments you thrive best in, right? So again, that goes back to that self-reflection. Well, where do I do my best work? Do I
Yeah.
like a big classroom, a smaller classroom? What kind of people do I feel like get me feeling the way I need to feel to do my best learning? So again, that does tie back to this idea of like self-reflection, even if that's how you feel after visiting a school in person or after a Zoom presentation. If you're like, oh wow, that made me feel good. Pay attention to that because those feelings um, are going to carry on once you're there, in your first year and so on.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in because we got a lot in the overall admissions picture from this past year. So you can treat me as like the lead news anchor now, hitting some of the headlines. And then we're gonna, in our news show, dive into some of the stories a little bit more deeply. So I'll cue Jim up in a moment. But some of these narratives, if you joined us a few months ago, are the same and were reinforced in the regular decision, you know, results that have been released. I will point out, by the way, that there are many universities that still have not released data on their regular decision and overall numbers. So that remains to be seen. But of what has been revealed, I think that one very illustrative set of statistics was the fact that Duke University in North Carolina, Vanderbilt University in Nashville now basically have the same acceptance rate as Yale. Um, the narrative of, we oftentimes will speak with students and parents and we ask them, we say, what is the Ivy League? And the answer, I gave everyone a second here to think about it, but the answer is the Ivy League is an athletic conference, right? It is no longer the 8 hardest universities to get into, or the 8 most rejected universities, as some may put it, in our nation, right? Well, Duke and Vanderbilt are not alone. We have Caltech, we have MIT, we have Stanford. The list goes on. And we're talking, these acceptance rates are sub 5% in many cases, guys, below 5%, right? And then you look at USC, Isaiah. I mean, what was the final number for you guys? It was single digits this year, right?
This year we are just over single digits. Last year at 9%, and I think this year we're 10.5.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
USC's right there, right?
yeah.
Notre Dame was sub 10% this year. And what you're seeing is there's really a new order here. It's not just the same 8 schools. There's a shift. And that shift is being heavily driven by two forces. One force is weather. Students want warmth. If you were here early enough to hear our small talk, all jokes aside, students want to go out and they want to enjoy that campus in the beautiful sun, right? The postcard moments all year long. And there's this revelation now that there are many unbelievable academic universities that also have sports and also have great weather. And that's the second factor, right? Which is the drive towards schools with school spirit. The number of times when a student and a family are talking and what's important to them, and one of the leading, if not the leading factors, is the college experience. We want to be there. Football game day, right? I go, great. Where you can, a great resource to build your college list and to research schools. I've the perfect menu for you. You type in your browser, ESPN.com. You click on NCAAF, and then click on teams. That is the list. That is the comprehensive menu of every university with a Division I football team. Then people ask me, like, are there any schools I'm not thinking of? I'm like, there's no secret schools. If that is your main criteria, that is it. That is the menu. Search here, right? And we are seeing more and more families prioritize this. So if there's one narrative that we've seen 2 years ago when we talked about this, and last year when Jim and I hosted this, and reinforced again this year in the early state of admissions, and now it is that there is a culture and a vibe shifts, in our high schools right now of what students are prioritizing and looking at. I don't care what happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago or when you were a kid, right? It's different. I mean, Isaiah, you're at one of these institutions. I mean, what are you seeing? I mean, you've been there 8 years. You just said, like,
Yeah.
Can you speak on?
We have seen, a jump in applications in recent years. And I think initially, COVID may have been a factor, switching to test optional may have been a factor, but this jump continues at a rate, higher than we had seen in previous years. And I think you're absolutely right. This idea, and I'll say, for background, I primarily recruit students from the greater Seattle area. And the idea of weather is actually a pretty big pool for them. They have UW in their backyard, which is a fantastic, big sports rah-rah school. But the idea of coming down to California really does hold a lot of weight. And I think you kind of pointed it out, but just like the opportunity for students to get, a real realistic idea of what the college experience looks like as we get information from different sources these days. I'm thinking students getting on TikTok and just seeing a student doing a day in the life at USC, and it looks beautiful. Right? And just having that big college experience after maybe feeling like you didn't get that in high school, even middle school due to COVID. I think that also plays a really big factor. The flip side of that is these students are excited to come to campus and get really involved. So I think it really just makes our environment more active, because that's one of the things that was a big deciding factor for them to come to a place like USC. I get the academics and I can go to a football game. I'm doing it all. And so students are, the number of things that they're involved in is always like, wow, how do you find the time? But that's why they're there.
And Isaiah, with the surge in applications, have you noticed any kind of cultural or vibe shift on campus that comes with it?
Yeah, I think the vibe shift would be based in that that emphasis on doing a lot. I guess like students are really interested and excited about taking advantage of everything USC has to offer. Usually in those first 2 years, usually after that they find the kind of thing that really makes USC the experience that they're looking for. But they're coming onto campus and really getting involved in so many things. And excited to do so. Oftentimes, like, how do you balance all that? That's something I always ask the students. That's what they're there for. So it's become a very exciting place, active place.
Well, I think USC is at the intersection, especially with its recent move with the addition of early decision, an asterisk. We'll get to that in a second, but I think that's another huge takeaway and trend in admissions from this year, right? Not that this is a huge breaking news revelation, but there's a tremendous advantage early decision. And there was a lot of stats on this. One, though, really struck me, right? Because we've heard things before, especially from schools like Tulane in the past, where, look, is it shocking that Emory and Northwestern this cycle filled essentially between one third and one half of their, the class of 2029 just from early decision? No, I don't think that's shocking. We've heard that before. But then you look at a school like Brown University, where early decision, the acceptance rate was 18%. And their overall, not regular, the overall final decision rate, acceptance rate was 5.5%, right? Look, I'm not a math major, but even I know that that means the regular decision, my 2-year-old can count that high to that percentage mark. Okay. So when we talk about early decision, and we've had a past guest on here, Isaiah, who loathes early decision for many good reason, but your institution just embraced it this past year. So what's the wisdom? What's the take here? Why do universities embrace early decision? Why should students and parents embrace it? And what should they understand when they're navigating this process, especially
Yeah. So I think institutions typically embrace early decision. And this kind of goes back to my initial point, because the job of an admission counselor and admission team is to really kind of build out the environment on campus that you're looking. So, the idea is that, okay, if we know students are going to come, if we know these students are excited, you can really kind of create that variety within your incoming class really early on in the process, and kind of start to build the foundation of what this incoming class will look like. And so there is a lot of value in that for institutions. For students and families, if you know and are excited and pretty confident in where you want to attend, and like you're saying, Eric, those numbers are very convincing, it doesn't make a lot of sense not to pursue an early decision route if you know, right, this is where I want to be. So just having that first or kind of first step, it kind of really makes the rest of the process ideally, right, a little bit easier going forward. USC is slower on the embracing early decision, and we were slower on embracing early action as well. So the conversation around early decision, which is specifically for our Marshall School of Business majors, only in that department right now as a pilot, is that the requirements, not requirements, I'll say, but what we're looking for in our students is not necessarily going to change. I'll tell you, there's not a specific target number of early decision admits that we are looking for. We're still looking for the most compelling students in early decision, the same as we would, an EA or regular decision. Every institution might go about it a little bit differently, but I think the conventional wisdom of, okay, well, let's really start kind of building out the class that we hope for as early as possible. I think that still does say the same and applies to USC.
On the flip side of it, as far as these top headlines, I got two more. One, I don't want to dwell on too long, but we talked a lot in the early state of admissions about the prevalence and dominance of deferrals. We're not going to rehash that here. However, wait lists have still exploded in recent years. This really was the case. It was parabolic in light of the pandemic, but it's shown no signs of slowing down. Again, the point of reference I would share is that, again, from doing this 15 years before COVID, I'd have a couple students get waitlisted. If they got waitlisted, would maybe be at one school, and you almost never got off it. Right. And it never happened until like May at the earliest, usually June or July. Now we have students routinely waitlisted at 2, 3, 4. I mean, even I think 5 was the record this year, schools for waitlist. And Isaiah, in the past 48 hours, I think 4 students of mine alone. I'm not even going to speak for our other amazing SA team leaders. 4 of mine got off a waitlist somewhere. It's wild. So, the wait lists are showing no signs of going away. And I will say, just to families entering this process and going through it, like, beware if you get to this late stage in the game, it does make it hard for students to fully celebrate and embrace where they got in, because there is truly greater hope that maybe one of these waitlists are going to work out, right? And there's so much pressure, guys, and I'm going to say this to all the parents here. And Isaiah, if you have thoughts on this as an admissions officer, I would love to hear them. There's so much pressure to commit on social media that you owe everyone else, this response, right? And then there's all the stuff that goes with it, like these bed parties now and whatever. I mean, this social and communal pressure is so enormous for these students when they should be enjoying where they got in. And do you have any wisdom and advice from what you've seen, and how do you enjoy this moment while still, yes, you can hold out a little bit of hope, not tons, not much, but like a little bit?
Yeah, that's really tough. And I think you kind of touched on something that is really here recently. Something that's been really difficult for me is that the TikToks, and I understand it's two-sided, because I want students that are able to celebrate, their admission decisions, to feel free to do so, but to also understand that this is an individualized process for all the students and families that are going through it. So I don't want students and families to feel, I don't know, that pressure. You said it right, just pressure. I've been lucky at USC in that we don't utilize a wait list, that we utilize spring admits kind of in lieu of a wait list. So we're able to offer students admission to the spring as a start date, so they know that they have a place to begin at USC. But I'll tell you too, a lot of times that pressure, they're also affected by that, because they aren't starting in the fall in the same way that most of their other students are. They might feel like most of their other classmates are. And so, end of the day, I think it's that reminder that this entire process is individualized. And this is not the only point in the process, but I think it's really important to just understand what it looks like for you, understand where you are at in this point in the process. And maybe try as best you can to encourage your friends if they're winning or celebrating their different successes, but know that yours might look a little bit different if that's the case right now, and that's okay. This is not the end of it. Even that first year is not. It is a long process, and being able to go through it and its different ups and downs again will serve you in the long term.
I'll give a quick shout out. This is a minor trend. I wasn't even going to touch on it until you said it, but there are more and more universities that are embracing that spring admit, where you say, congratulations, you've been accepted to our university, but you start date will be in the spring, right? Not in the fall, but the following spring. Or there's a lot of schools now who will say, congratulations, we're giving you a conditional acceptance. You have to attend another institution for the next year, maintain a certain grade level. And if you do that, you will get automatically enrolled in our school. And mind you, this is not, you may hear that in your head stereotype. Okay, well, what schools do I think that would be like? Well, guess what? Georgia Tech, one of those schools, 8.93, I think I get that right, percent acceptance rate out of state. In Cornell University, Ivy League, embraces this, right? I mean, it's a cool thing, and I will just give a sales pitch for it, which is I tell students and parents all the time, I know there's so much pressure, like you just said, Isaiah, on like the immediacy and the now and the focus on like what's right in front of you. And I try to tell people all the time, I'm like, look, you said that your end goal was to get to this university. Congratulations, you did it. You can get a diploma with that name on it. right? In 20 years from now, no one's going to ask you, where did you live and study first semester that fall? They're going to say, where'd you graduate from? So I think that perspective and giving students that option is amazing. You also use the term individualized, which sets me up for my last point before I throw it to Jim for some major headlines in testing and majors, which is this. We just painted some broad strokes. And you're going to hear from a lot of parents and read a lot of articles about the broad strokes in trends. But I want to say this to every family very clearly. If you really want to understand how the admissions is changing, you cannot look at it with broad strokes and an overall level. It is so individualized because as much as there's a trend towards big rah-rah Division I football, warm weather schools, who had their best year ever. If you're admissions officer looking to reject the most, number of students and get your acceptance rate as low as possible. So at best is a very loose air quote. NYU, 7.7% acceptance rate, right? There's so much chatter, and rightfully so in some cases, about liberal arts colleges losing applicants. You know who also had their most highly rejected, lowest acceptance rate year ever? Amherst, by I think like 1.5 percentage points too, right? It was pretty significant, right? So I just would encourage, families and students, you gotta understand and look and ask questions about individual trends, right? I mean, one thing we talked about and got reinforced, University of Wisconsin, right? State legislature passed a law, making it more protectionist of in-state applicants this year. And, look, on their Q&A they posted, just so no one goes and tries to check this and, tries to fact check us or something. On their FAQs, they say, there's a question, will this affect out-of-state admissions? And they say no. First of all, how can you say that? They posted that before the decisions came out, okay? Anyone who can do simple math, how is that not, I don't want to go into details about the whole thing there, but there's no way that it wasn't affecting out-of-state admissions, right? Especially in an economy and in a time where people are looking to stay in state at their flagship university. So, you really year to year, each university is its own story. So it's important to understand the bigger picture, but it's really important to understand schools on my list and how they're changing. And it's something that Jim and I and our team talk with students about all the time. But you know what? The thing that Jim likes talking about most, as a board member of the National Test Prep Association, Jim loves talking about the SAT and ACT. He is our resident test prep nerd. And one thing that we're going to talk about now is everyone's favorite subject, the SAT and ACT, especially test optional. So what were the trends this year with test optional, Jim and Isaiah?
Sure. So I'll start off by just giving kind of a general picture, and then Isaiah and I will kind of go back and forth on some of the kind of nuanced points here. So generally speaking, just about every college and university in the country went test optional in 2020 because students lost their ability to take the SAT and ACT for a period of time there during COVID shutdowns. Since then, we've seen a sort of slow trickle of some colleges coming back to requiring scores and other colleges reaffirming their commitment to stay test optional. And there are a few schools out there who will not consider SAT or ACT scores at all. Really, the notable names there, as far as our students are concerned, are the California State and University of California systems. They're the only schools that are popular with our students who are test blind. But what we've seen in this trickle back, the first domino to fall was the University of Tennessee. And the University of Tennessee, they went back to requiring scores just about as quickly as students could get back into test centers to take them. After that, we started to see University of Georgia, other large southern state schools. MIT was the first domino to fall in the second category of schools that is more likely to require test scores, which is highly selective schools. MIT and Georgetown were the first two there. Since then, a lot of the Ivy League has followed suit. For a while, for a few years, it really seemed like the colleges that were requiring test scores were either large southern state schools or some of the most highly selective schools in the country. And there really were almost no exceptions to that. I think this spring we're starting to see some other dominoes fall, and notably for our students, we're University of Miami, a private school, Southern but not a state school, right? Ohio State, state school but not Southern. And so we're starting to see the boundaries of which types of schools are going back to requiring scores be pushed. Now, no one is expecting some kind of universal walk back to every college requiring the SAT and ACT. It's very unlikely in the current climate for that to happen. But we expect the trickle to continue. So students who, decide to apply without test scores are still going to have plenty of options in the coming years. But there will be specific schools where if a student's interested in, they will really need to, most likely test and submit those scores. With the, with when we talk about test optional is an umbrella term. So it covers 80 or maybe even more percent of colleges and universities out there. But test optional means different things in different places. So you have colleges that have been test optional since the 60s, like Bates, right? You have colleges that are test optional in a way in name only, or test optional only under certain circumstances, like Auburn, right? Just two examples on the extreme of either end, but there's a whole continuum in between of just how optional is test optional and who is it optional for. These things are going to be different from one student to the next. And that's the first thing I want to hear from Isaiah about, is just take us behind the curtain at USC and how USC views test scores. And then if there's anything about your kind of personal approach or understanding to these tests that differs from the institutional philosophy, I'd be interested to hear that too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you highlighted that test optional can mean different things at different institutions. So it's really important to get a good idea of the institution that you're looking at. At USC, we have really embraced and been clear on saying that when we say test optional, we mean test optional in every aspect of the phrase, right? So it does not jeopardize like merit consideration. We don't mean test optional, but if you're in this specific program, we need to see test score. You're test optional, and it is really, again, individualized, and we really rely on students to understand if providing a test is good information for their application. And so, me, having read applications for many years, I can say the context of each test score is really important in my review. When I'm looking at a student that does submit a score, I'm going to consider it within the context of their high school experience. I'm going to look at, what test scores look like in their neighborhood and their high school, and kind of really take that all into consideration the same way that I would for their grades, so the GPA and that kind of thing, right? So that's important at USC and our admission office, and there's something that you train on to be able to understand each individualized student's test score. Personally, I do believe the tests do what they're supposed to do. And that is to determine the first year GPA of students at college. So most universities that utilize tests will use a combination to get a good understanding of, a combination of both the test scores and the high school GPA to get a good understanding, and predict how that student is going to do in their first year. My personal belief is that we get good information from the GPA. I believe that the information that we get from the GPA, or I would say the information that we get from the scores, kind of the harm that they do outweighs the benefit. If the student does well academically at their school, I believe we get it enough to determine they'll do well at USC in that first year. And when I say the harm, what I really mean is that students that might see our middle 50% and decide, oh, I'm not going to submit an application to USC because my test score doesn't fall into that range, while me reading their application within the context, of their high school experience. Let's say, for instance, it's a student from a rural town. Well, their test score, while not within our middle 50%, it's actually a really good score for their school. And that's a student that I would want not to self-select out of the application process.
Right. And to elaborate just for 1 second on the mechanics of what Isaiah is talking about there. With your high school transcript travels something called a school profile that every high school in the country has. And that school profile includes information about your high school that can put your application in context. So if Isaiah is assigned to the Seattle area, he probably knows the high schools in the Seattle area very well, right? USC can have an admissions officer tasked with the Seattle area. A small liberal arts school in Ohio might not have someone specifically for the Seattle area, and they need a way to get context on these schools in the Seattle area to understand what does an A mean at this school, or what kind of context am I actually looking at here? And the average test score will be on there so that admissions officers can see relative to the average from your high school, what does your test score look like? And that's why we can't just blindly be looking at these middle 50 percentile, stats for colleges when you're trying to make these decisions. We got a question from the Q&A that's probably a good time to answer right now too, which is, do you think that the range of test scores are skewed by the fact that only students with high scores submit? And how do you determine whether to submit or not? So the first part of that question is very easy to answer. Yes. If 50% of students submitted scores, it was the top 50%, right? That's a pretty obvious thing to anyone who stops to think about it. And the average of the top 50% is what we used to call the 75th percentile, right? So admissions officers are aware of that. You see Isaiah nodding along here. This is not news to anyone.
Well,
all colleges saw their ranges jump when they went test optional, and they all know why.
Well, I have a question for both of you in light of this, and I understand this is speculation if neither of you want to say anything or put yourselves out there. But, one question we're getting a lot now is that with so many schools going back to tests required this coming fall, right? So the current juniors who are going to be applying as seniors in the fall, there's a growing list of schools, it seems ever growing by the week, that are re-embracing tests required. And the question I keep getting asked is, well, do you anticipate that median 50 percentile range, right, the average scores, to then go down at those schools? So I'm wondering, is there buzz in admissions offices or admissions circles of like what we can anticipate? And, should that even influence anything at all in building a test prep plan if you're a sophomore or a junior?
I do think students that are going to be scoring on the higher end are going to continue to choose to submit their scores. And I would tell you, more often than not, because we do still request scores from students after they matriculate to USC, even if they applied test optional. And so that data is not perfect because not every student submits their test scores after they matriculate, but we get a good amount. Generally, their scores are still really good. They're just not reflective of that, higher 1,500 and up. And that's a USC kind of situation. So I, even though more students take the test, I do still anticipate the higher performing students will be the ones that choose to submit.
And to answer the part of Eric's question about how does that affect the test prep plan, I always say when we have a specific college goal for which we can make a specific score goal, that's a beautiful thing in the test prep world, because the more clarity we have on exactly what we're shooting for, the better a strategy we can help a student form. So it's awesome when we can do that. Since COVID, we've been able to do that less and less because it seems like such a moving and nebulous target. Often you can do that with, for example, some of the large Southern state schools that have merit grids on their websites, which is when they publish, if your GPA is this and your SAT or ACT is this, and you're an out-of-state applicant and you get in, we will give you exactly this many thousands of dollars a year in scholarship money. In that case, obviously, a very clear objective for test prep. It's thousands of dollars of saved money. But most of the time, what we're trying to do is figure out, what is the test score that we can coach a student to, up against what we call the point of diminishing returns. In other words, at what point does the time and effort that you would spend on test prep end up better spent on things like your extracurricular activities? You should be prioritizing, of course, your actual schoolwork the whole time, hopefully. While the SAT or ACT is more important than any one test you take in school, your grades in school are generally considered, extremely significant I would say more significant than test scores at all but the very most selective schools, and especially the ones that require test scores. There's actually a study that came out last month by the National Bureau of Economic Research that said at the Ivy Plus schools, standardized testing is like the most powerful predictive factor. And what they defined as Ivy Plus, I'm not going to get into, but they meant, some of the most selective schools in the country. And the point here was essentially that when you have a situation where there's widespread grade inflation, which is where we are now, and you're only having the best students in the whole country apply to your school, the GPAs just don't differ enough to tell the story. So when you're trying to compare one student to another, and all of the students have never gotten anything but an A, it's like, well, what can a GPA really do in that situation, right? That's not to say that you can never be admitted to any of those schools if you've ever gotten anything less than an A. I don't mean to imply that. But the point is that they rely on standardized test scores to a greater extent than many other schools do. So, and this comes back to the point that Isaiah and I both made earlier, where when it comes to test optional, it is school by school. There's nothing I can say here that is just going to always be true. The closest I can come to is my personal belief that if your SAT score is above a 1450, ACT score above a 33, send the dang score, because the college is not, going to penalize you for that score at that point. And if you think about like the most cynical operator within a test optional college, thinking like, oh, if they didn't submit that score, that means it's bad. They're not thinking with no score that, oh, it was a 1450 and they didn't submit it because it wasn't a 1500, right? That is not where their head goes when they see an application without a test score. So that's kind of a blanket number that I speak to a lot of people with, the closest to a universal piece of advice I can come to. But aiming for that score is not the right decision for every student either. And I don't mean to say that. It's just the closest to general advice on test optional that there is.
And just before you bring it home with testing, and APs and then pivot into major selection, I do just want to give a quick shout out, shamelessly, to say that, Jim, if you can't tell, just speaks with such compassion and expertise on this subject. And one of the things we're really proud of as a company is that you're not just getting an amazing tutor, you're getting the team behind it, and having Jim be able to meet with your family and talk about goal setting and responsible, expenditure of resources and effort, and strategizing, really that individualized approach for your family is so enormous. And just thank you to Jim for all the hard work you do there. Now I'll let you nerd out. I'll also say there's some awesome questions coming through the Q&A in the chat. Keep them coming. We're going to be addressing these. We promise.
Yeah. And since I'm bad at taking a compliment from Eric, let me just continue on with the joke, which is when I started in the test prep world, I assumed I'd be dealing with a lot of crazy parents, but normally it's a parent calling me saying, hey, can you, my student is having extreme anxiety about these tests. Can you help? And it's the student saying, no, I need to keep doing test prep forever, forever, forever. And me having to talk them out of it in certain situations. I expected crazy parents. I got some very tightly wound students. And I love both the students and the parents, but talking with a family up front in the process about how to make these plans is really one of my favorite parts of the job.
And I'll add, I get this question, quite a bit. Should I test? And really, and you should. And I think the way you all talk about test prep and coaching around the test, it's really encouraging. Where we are in terms of the landscape, kind of how we've mentioned, every school does a little something differently. This individualized process, I think it is important right now to take it and try to do your best. And so any support in that will be helpful.
Isaiah, just because you just responded to all this with such compassion, we're gonna, exploit you for being the hardest question, which we just got, which is, so why have a test if we have to coach a student to master it? It's such a hypocritical thought process for a college to even consider.
Yeah.
You guys,
that's a great question, and there's a lot of validity to that. And I think there's a lot in the education system that students benefit from extra help in. I had a writing tutor. I had a tutor in Spanish during high school, right? And it helped me. Those aren't parts of the the test specifically, but they did help me perform better on my transcript, which kind of like we talked about, right? Important part of the application. So I think of it as just another component of receiving additional help through your academics, um, in this specific sphere of testing, which is a component of the application. And a lot of folks, if you are intending to apply to college and high school, you're working on those different components in many different ways.
Despite
Yeah, and
initial,
I think there's just a bit of a misunderstanding about the tests. I mean, Isaiah said earlier the tests do what they're supposed to, which is to, predict a student's freshman year GPA at college. They're meant to test underlying skills in math and reading, and in the ACT's case, science and writing. Well, writing on both tests. Yeah. Um, that you can get better at those subjects with a personal coach. I can't think of a single human pursuit that you can't get better at with a personal coach. You want to learn a language, learn an instrument, get better at yoga, have a personal trainer, you know, improve your business. I mean, if you have the right coach who's going to support you the right way, you can get better at anything. I mean, trying to task colleges with finding a metric that's uncoachable, at that point, we're turning college admissions into Minority Report. If your life experience and the way that you improve at something isn't, a part of how you're evaluated on it.
well, I'll add one more thing, and I love that this is now organically we're starting to interweave the different topics. So we had later on our list talking about the emergence of AI, right? I think this is a good time to touch on it now, right? When we're talking about of the factors you control and how this sudden surge in AI, and again, we can speculate all we want, right? And how it's going to influence things. But let's just look at the two quantitative things in your control: grades and standardized test scores. And, for those of you who've been in the past webinars, Jim puts up these unbelievable, shocking graphs of grade inflation over the past 50 years and how the standardized test average scores have stayed the same. And I think while you can say a lot and make many critiques about standardized tests in the past over the years and still in the present and perhaps the future, to the extent that the SAT literally doesn't stand for scholastic aptitude test because they couldn't prove that it measures your aptitude. So literally SAT is just a branding acronym, like it doesn't stand for anything. I think moving forward, we're going to see people, at least admissions offices fall back in love with standardized tests because the grade inflation is just going to get worse with ChatGPT and other AI tools out there. And standardized tests at their core are standardized, right? And no one make a snarky comment about the Varsity Blues scandal, right? Like that's an outlier. AI can't do this. And I think admissions officers, and Isaiah, maybe you want to speak to this, but I think there's going to be a renaissance of standardized test prep. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, it won't be shocking. Even a couple of years ago, we've seen a trend of defying logic. The University of California in your state, now home state, Isaiah, did a 2-year study to see, if standardized tests, if SAT and ACT scores were in any way hindering, diversity on campus and, bringing, promoting access and equity, were the SAT and ACT hindering it? And the 2-year study found that the SATs and ACTs actually helped improve access and diversity on campuses. And what did the University of California do? They went test blind, right? I mean, it's literally defying logic in research in the statistics. So, I mean, Isaiah, am I wrong?
Yeah. Those were the findings of that study. And, I still do believe that test optional can be done well. That's my personal belief. Again, I do believe that there's a lot of value in the test. And right now with where we are, it is important to do as much as you can to do well in the test. But, Chicago's has done well for many years with their policy. I wish that there was more clarity from different institutions and how the policy looks at their institution. And my wish is I wish that so that families could plan well for whatever works best for them. I don't want that stress and the conversations that we have to translate to students and families not knowing what to do. That's really my biggest concern with test options. With schools would say we're test blind, or we accept the test, whatever works best for us as an institution, we have determined, and we could go from there so families could navigate what is right now, I believe, a pretty confusing time for testing.
We echo the desire for more transparency.
Yeah, so this is maybe a great segue into some data from the University of Pittsburgh, actually, because in the interest of transparency, this is the only college I know of that does this. But essentially, different universities, they have multiple schools you can apply into. So you might apply into the engineering school, the business school, the nursing school, et cetera. And admission into those schools is a different thing. And the class profiles are going to look different, including average test scores and how test optional they are. And I wanted to show you all, as we segue into a conversation on the impact of majors and what major you're selecting on your application, what this looks like at the University of Pittsburgh, which has this beautifully transparent statement on their website of, okay, so here we have the Dietrich School of Arts and Sciences. Arts and sciences means this is what you apply into if you're studying English literature, philosophy, or if you're studying, biology or chemistry or physics. And you can see all of their stats. They show you how test optional, meaning what percentage of students were admitted without test scores. We head over to the Swanson School of Engineering, and we see that the stats look different. In fact, the test optional percentage looks very different. And this is a trend I think we've seen anecdotally with our students, and data has supported where data is available on this, which is that for engineering programs generally, test scores are more valued by most universities. But they'll show you the variable data for the School of Business. Pitt separates out computer science into its own school. That's going to be more similar to engineering. A lot of colleges will house computer science in their College of Engineering and call it computer engineering or computer and electrical engineering or something like that. And we see nursing. So the point here is that even within one university, we have some drastic differences on what test optional means, on what that middle 50% range of SAT scores is, on what the average GPA is. So the point here is that, what you apply for in the college admissions process matters, not just the overall college name. And I bring this up to segue us into a conversation about how major selection impacts the process and what students can do about that. We often get the question, Isaiah, and I would love your thoughts on this about, well, I really want to study business, but the business school at, State University X is so competitive. I'm thinking maybe I'll just apply into the General College of Arts and Sciences and transfer into business later. Is that a wise move, and why or why not?
Yeah, they don't say it as explicitly to me, but I get that question quite a bit as well. And the idea here is just that, it's going to be easier for me to get into a major like anthropology, for instance, just off the top of my head, than it would be for me to get into my business major. And I think, I love that data because it is really helpful, but we also have to remember that there's so many other components in the application that are really important in the review process as well, all the different qualitative components that we take into consideration. So, business is a very popular major across the board more often than not, and they tend to get a lot of applications. But the student who's really interested in business is going to submit their best application to business. They're going to have activities. They're going to have be able to explain their interest with passion. All of those things will really kind of translate to them submitting that strongest application of business. If they apply to anthropology, it's kind of forgetting that there's this other student that's really jazzed about anthropology. That's going to have a bunch of activities and this, a strong passion for anthropology that's going to shine through in their application. So it really sets you up to submit a weaker application. And the analogy I like to use is when you talk to someone who's really, really passionate about something. And then even if it's not an interest of yours, you kind of start to get interested in that because they're just so excited about it. I talked to a professor who's doing research in dementia today at lunch during our presentation. I don't know, I'm not a science guy. I don't know anything. The way he spoke about it, I was just like, wow, that's interesting. I had questions because he was just so excited about the research that he was doing. So that's kind of how I like to frame how your application is going to reach to the reader when you are applying to those things that you're really passionate about.
Well, Isaiah, I have to jump ahead again. We were going to talk about the role of evaluating essays, and USC on this point actually has quite a striking. Their signature supplement essay is, I believe, in 250 words.
Yeah.
Explain to USC why you've chosen this major that you selected on your application, and also why you want to study it at USC. I'm curious about 2 points. Number one, what are you guys looking for in that essay? Is it more about the student and their intellectual pursuits, or is it more about why USC? And to what extent do you want them imagining themselves in the essay at USC, citing specific resources? But I'm also curious, while it's great to hear a student nerd out and deep dive on a subject, what's the value or what's the emphasis that you've seen in your office and maybe others on intersectionality as far from an intellectual standpoint? Like,
Yeah.
one of the students this year I worked with, just who had unbelievable success, and I just knew it was going to happen. You talk about that genuine authenticity, had a dual interest in pre-med and Russian literature.
Yeah.
And they weren't separate entities. He genuinely found a mix of them, and it was unbelievable. I mean, it was just every essay was inspiring to read. Is that more a brand that colleges are looking for when a student cannot just be multi-curious, but then finds ways to intersect that? So that's a loaded question with a
Yeah.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah. No, so I'll start at the why USC question, which is a very challenging question to your point of it only being 250 words. What we're really looking for is that intersection that the student envisions between them as an academic within their major and us as an institution. So part of that is talking specifically to your major, but also why the USC is the best place to do your best learning within that major, right? So the trap in that question is that there's a lot of things to do. And so you want to list them all. Or like, oh, this is my day in the life and I do this and that. The ask is really to focus on those one or two things that stand out above all else. You mentioned that interdisciplinary approach of USC, which is really important. So I was talking with a student last week who, in answering that question, she said, oh, I came to USC because I could do neuroscience and music. That's why I came. That's a perfect answer to that. It doesn't always have to be interdisciplinary, but there is an emphasis on that at USC. About 2/3 of our students do have a dual major or an additional minor, but it could be a specific study abroad experience. It could be a specific research experience. It could be the opportunity to do all those things at a big school, kind of like we talked about earlier. I think in the word count limitation, it's really important to just find that one thing, hone in on that, be concise, be articulate. It's not the time for the flowery language, right? It is, I want to go to you. We know your major already. I want to go to USC and study this because, and just get right to it. Again, goal being, this is how I envision this partnership between me as a student and as an institution. There's a second part of that. Oh, yeah.
No, I think you somehow covered like all of it.
Okay, yeah.
And what you want out of the essay and the fact that institutions like USC do embrace that intersectionality, and that seems to be an increasing trend these days. I'm giddily smiling hearing you say like you don't write in beautiful flowery language on a 250 word essay, right? It's like content is king, and
Yeah.
write well, write compellingly, but like
Yeah.
you're
Get to
with
it.
me with detail, not with a
Yeah.
high vocabulary. So that was warmed my heart as
Yeah. Yes.
One interesting trend I've noticed kind of over the years is when I first started in this space, Eric and I, when he was back in the Philly area, we used to do these presentations in people's living rooms, like Tupperware
Oh
parties, but
wow.
for like a kind of an overview of the college admissions process. And we would have to speak against this like pervasive idea people had of the well-rounded college admissions applicant. Check your music box and your sports box and your community service and this and that and the other thing. And you need to, have a perfect circle that you've got an interest in every direction. Since then, I think we've seen like sort of a greater emphasis on what we call the pointy applicant, where it's more about building depth in a very hyper specific area of interest. And that was what was most compelling to colleges, at least writ large. Obviously, every institution's different, every application's different. And now we're seeing this sort of like have texture moment, which is really refreshing because I think it's the way people normally are, where it's like, sure, have a primary academic focus that is like, your driving factor, but bringing in other elements of what makes you you is what's really going to make this sing to an admissions officer.
Yeah.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, I really love the word choice of texture. I think that really kind of sums it up well. And I think it kind of relates to this idea I was talking about earlier about being exciting to teach and being a good group, member. This idea of like, once you transition into to college, it's kind of a switch. You're not, the grades are still important, of course, but it's more about like, what am I going to learn and how am I going to learn? So showcasing that interest in really just like learning might look like a couple different things. It might look like, oh, I know how to learn in different capacities. I think that just translates really well to the student that is going to be successful on a campus like USC, right, where there are a lot of different things and opportunities for intersectional learning and that kind of thing. And so you see that in the activities list, you see that in how a student talks about some of those things that are important to them, just that idea of like, okay, I almost kind of think we borrow that from the liberal arts in some ways, right? I've kind of taken this high school time to get a little bit of everything and maybe find that one thing that I'm really passionate about. So I think that's the why behind this move towards a well-rounded student.
Well, to that point, in talking strategically, in this state of admissions, right? Um, you know, one thing Jim and I have been talking a lot about, Isaiah, leading up to tonight, is this idea that so much these days is not even just where you apply to, but how you apply to within the school. And I think this touches on the major, and I want to get back to that and really hear and reinforce this point of, the student who wants to apply business or engineering, but then is scared, but they really want USC and they're not, but they really want business, right? It's not like I'm not sure. I really want engineering, but I really want USC, right? And I want to get back to that with you. I mean, I do just want to give a quick shout out when we're talking about, it's not all about strategy and major selection. One thing I want to just quickly share and observe is that look for schools where there's value. No, I'm not just talking about merit scholarship money, all that's granted, but one thing that I heard over and over and over again this year was honors colleges. Families just didn't understand enough about them entering this process in this journey. And Isaiah, I don't know if you want to touch on this point at all when I flip it back to you, but honors colleges, sometimes when a student applies to a university, you need to fill out a concerted application separately with essays. Penn State notoriously has 10 essays. University of Pitt has 1. Ohio State and Maryland, on the opposite ends of Pennsylvania where we're founded, you're just automatically qualified just by applying to the school. But I feel like these honors colleges where you get priority access to housing, to classes, to research, to other resources and supports and advisors and mentorship. Excuse me. I mean, no one's thinking about it at the onset. Everyone's so focused on the bumper sticker that they're not thinking about the value and, to your point of where am I going to thrive, Isaiah, right? Excuse me. And one anecdote I want to share is one of the students I'm absolutely the proudest of this year She got into a lot of different schools, but two of those schools were Vanderbilt University and University of South Carolina honors. And she very proudly and almost unhesitatingly chose South Carolina honors. And when I talked to her about it, she just said, right, like, why would I put myself in debt? I have unbelievable access and resources to everything. I just like, we oftentimes talk with students and we say, we don't care where you apply, right? Not because we don't care about you, but because we really care about you, right? Your happiness is our success. We just want to give you as many options as possible. So you're the chooser, not the choosy, right? Could not be prouder of her. So I would say to families who are navigating this and feeling overwhelmed and looking at the landscape and saying there's so many reaches and it seems like there's no target, you know what? Maybe look at schools that you deem as likely and find value where there's some honors college where you are king or queen of the campus and shining with every access and opportunity and advantage, because you may get into your reach school. And I will tell you, we've had students transfer out of colleges the past 2 or 3 years because it is so competitive just to get into a club, not a fraternity, right? Not a research position, to clubs. So, that's one point I wanted to hit on tonight. But Isaiah, what do you say to the families who aren't just looking at impacted majors like computer science, but just the school, right? Do I apply to the College of Business? Do I apply to the College of Engineering? How much does this matter? And even maybe within a given college, like, should I apply art history versus undecided or neuroscience? Like, do I lead with something? Like, where do you and I know you're going to want to give the holistic advice too,
Yeah.
but would love the strategic advice.
Yeah. And I would say at USC, it does matter. And, in kind of being overly strategic, I can say we can tell sometimes when a student is applying to a major outside of what their primary interest is. And that's a student that we will be, less excited about, right? Because it's just not going to be that compelling application. So it is important to really kind of ask yourself, is there a major, if you're hesitant and I guess worried about your primary major and the competitiveness within that major, what's more important, right? Is there another major that I'll still be happy at? And what's more important, this institution or this specific major? To Eric's point, I'm sure there are tons of institutions, right, where you might find that you can find that specific major in a less competitive sense. And that might be, okay, maybe I'll apply to that here. And maybe for this more competitive institution, maybe I'll decide to apply this different major that still fulfills my needs in terms of what I want to learn and how I want to grow it. And we'll see where we can go from there. So I think it's still important to have that passion piece in whatever you decide to apply to, but do understand the major that you're applying to and kind of that application process that you're committing to within the institution that you choose in that major.
Yeah. You raise such a interesting point in saying, right, what's more important to you, this institution or the major? And oftentimes when I feel like our team is confronted with the question, it's a student who says, no, this is exactly what I want to study. And I feel like my response, Isaiah, is oftentimes like, well, why would you apply for an education and pay tens of thousands of dollars a year for an education you don't really want? Am I wrong? Am I being, short-sighted? Or, is there any argument to prioritize the institution over the major if you know what you want to study?
And most often when I ask that question, those students are like, yeah, it is the major, right? Because you know what you want to study, you know what you want to learn, you know what you want to kind of grow in. And again, that best application is going to be in that major because that's what you're passionate about. So you're absolutely right in understanding, right, that process. But this is your major. That's it. You got it. Honestly, kind of lucky in a lot of different ways because it can take some time to figure out what it is exactly you want to do. So with that, kind of just move forward confidently, knowing, okay, my goal is to submit the best application. for myself that reflects all the different aspects of who I am in this major. That's really the college application process, right? But like you said earlier, it's individualized, um, understanding what that process is for you in that major. And you're right, you're spending the money for what you want to learn.
The last big point we want to talk about before we have a robust Q&A, people even submitted some questions before tonight, and we're still getting them now in the chat and Q&A. But we have to talk about the huge, not so elephant in the room, because it's not like nobody's talking about it, which is AI. And I alluded to this earlier. And Isaiah, I just want to flip it at you, right? Because, I don't think ChatGPT was in the general vernacular a year ago when we did this. Who
Right.
knows where we'll be a year from now?
Yeah.
But what's happening,
Yeah.
your perspective? And we're curious because there's as much as there's been chatter about, applicants using ChatGPT,
Mhm.
not just in the admissions process, but in their high school careers. There's a lot of chatter and speculation about AI being leveraged by admissions offices.
Mhm.
So what do you say to the people who are feeling very anxious or skeptical or scared, or there's obviously the body that's very curious and excited about all of this too. So
Yeah. Yeah. On our end, within admission in the office, having just wrapped up our, for my territory, my 2,200 applications for the year, tell you with 100% confidence, AI was not utilized in any point of our process, right? And that's really important to us that, students knowing, we're real people reading your applications. We know that you spent a lot of time in the application. We respect that in our reviews of the application. We're going to read them and figure out how to get through the work to be able to do that. And I know, I have colleagues that work at other institutions, and I haven't heard a lot of chatter about AI completely summarizing portions of the application, reading applications, or anything like that. Historically, I would say education is a little slow on the pickup in terms of education, which can be a good thing, right? We want to make sure that we're not just introducing random technology into this process that might not serve as a benefit to applicants. So the most I've heard is things like AI calculating GPAs. So, I wouldn't be surprised if we might be in that space in the next couple of years, but I don't. That's nothing that's coming, in 1 or 2 years. And I can say in assurance we're not going to be using AI at USC specifically anytime soon.
we were specifically asked, I think this is the final point before we'll move to Q&A, but it was a question that came up towards the tail end of our early State of Admissions webinar, Isaiah, about, our admissions officers and, offices, pardon me, employing AI, right? Instead of, as you said, a human being, reading it. Some of it being outsourced to technology. And it was really the first moment I was confronted with that question. And Jim and I were talking and, like texting on the side and being like, oh boy, here we go. Like, what are we going to do? And I have to say, I gave a response that I really feel genuine about, and I'm curious what your response is. And I just said, you know what, at the end of the day, right, let's say AI is evaluating an application. On some level, I said, that's great, because whatever rubric they're putting into an AI, we talk a lot about this idea of being better person, better applicant, engaging with activities in ways that bring joy and meaning and purpose and intention and excitement and impact, writing essays that, go beyond the resume and reflect values and what you're going to contribute to campus and show off personality, add that other dimension. And I just said, look, if that's the rubric they're going to input in that AI, like, great, go for it. The students we coach, our kids are going to be great in admissions this year, and every year that's being used. And I guess I'm curious, like, you as a human being, Isaiah, you are. I mean, Is that your rubric when you're looking at activities and essays? Because I think people want to know, like, you do all this stuff, like, does it count,
Yeah,
right? How does
yeah,
it matter? How is it evaluated?
yeah. If I had to summarize in one word as best I could, it would be excellence. And that's within the understanding that excellence looks completely different in so many different ways across so many different students. But that idea of bringing excellence to whatever it is you do, that's something that you can grasp, right? Um, and so when we evaluate applications, generally that is what we're looking for. We're looking for students that almost have the courage to be excellence within the context of their high school experience and everything that they chose to do, and have the ability to articulate that excellence to me is the root. So I mean, like the most simple way that I can, that really that's really what we're looking for in the application process, because that's going to translate well to continue to make our institutions what they are, and that's what we strive for as an institution. Is
Just so your answer isn't misinterpreted,
mm-hmm.
I think I'm hearing you, and the message is beautiful, but I fear that there's a lot of students and parents who will hear that word excellence, Isaiah, and be
Mm-hmm.
really irritated by it, candidly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, what's the human side of excellence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, because I think we can all posture what excellence looks like in a given activity.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, and I know it may be hard to define, but what is excellence, as a human being?
Yeah, so excellence is not perfection, right? Excellence is not having faced the most grand challenges or being the most unique. And when I say there's so many different ways that excellence can look, I'll give you some examples. That could be uh, having the courage to get out there and be the most valued, or not most, but the most improved player on your high school basketball team, right? That's excellent. You're awarded for the effort that you put in, even in something that you might not be the best at. It could be, having the courage to bring a new initiative to your high school campus for something that you really care about, starting a club or a mentorship program. And so I'm giving these examples to kind of paint a picture of what that might translate and really look like for a student. It could be, pursuing research opportunities as a high school student, and taking initiative to find those in your neighborhood. It could be starting a company, whether that's something that has to do with software development or going out and mowing lawns, right? It can mean so many different things, but it is just that idea of striving for, I guess, something that is important to you and making progress in that. So that's what I think of when I kind of think of that
I,
idea of
I love
excellence.
that.
Yeah.
Um, Jim, I think, could go back and forth on the Q&A here, but a bridge that I'd love to build off of that is, again, that playing with that idea of excellence. One of the questions we got, and guys, this is Q&A time, so start asking, right? Is most 17-year-olds don't know what they want to do, are undecided majors at a disadvantage. Do you recommend specifying a major and unsure? So can there be excellence for someone who's undecided?
Yeah, absolutely. So for USC, you do have to apply directly to a major, and we do not have undecided as a major. There's undecided engineering, but that's still a little more specific. So when I talk to students about that, you might be undecided because there's a lot of things that you want to talk about. That maybe you're choosing between a passion or something new that you want to experience. It's totally okay to talk about that. Um, at USC, we do encourage you to have some specificity about what pathway you might want to take. So you might say, well, I know I want to be in the humanities. This is a good starting point for me. The specific major is a good starting point for me. This is how I envision learning in the humanities. Um, you know, that's my starting point because of this, right? Developing your interest is an important part of the application process. Again, I will say for USC, and that's having the opportunity to have some sort of experience within it. You don't know what you're going to like until you have the opportunity to do it. So taking some time, whether that's through clubs or activities or over the summer, to get some experience with different types of things might open you up to the things that you want to do.
We use a term a lot. We talk about being actively undecided, right? You have
I
to
love it.
be, you know, expressing in your essay on your application being genuinely curious and inquisitive and
Yeah.
interested. Is that a phrase that resonates with you?
I love that phrase. I'm gonna actually use that in the future myself. Actually, it's great.
There you go. I trademarked it so we can
Okay,
negotiate.
I got you. I'll let them know.
All right,
Jim,
then. Should I bring us into the next question?
let's do it.
All right. So two questions on this, which are sort of the same question. How do colleges view science on the ACT being test optional? So little backstory for everyone. The ACT is changing formats this fall. And as of that change, the science section will now be optional for every student when they sign up for the ACT. Most colleges have not yet made public their policy on the optionality of the science section of the ACT in particular. Before I tackle this one, I'm curious, Isaiah, has USC come to any kind of public policy on the ACT science section yet, or no?
No, we have not. I imagine that will be something that we'll discuss in training over the summer.
Right. And that's what I figured is, we kind of had to get past May 1st before we're going to hear from most universities on these kinds of decisions. What I will say about it is that from my standpoint, ACT science doesn't become optional when ACT says it's optional. It becomes optional when the colleges say it's optional. Stanford has come out and said it's optional at Stanford. But then the Bright Futures Scholarship Program, which is one of the biggest scholarship programs in the country for the state of Florida, for Florida public and private schools, they are requiring the ACT science section. So we've seen basically that one of the largest scholarship programs in the country is requiring it. One of the most famous colleges in the country isn't. And that's about all the data we have right now. So we're keeping our finger on the pulse of this, but until further notice, science is still required as far as I'm concerned, because we haven't heard from enough colleges that it's optional.
Speaking of science, one of our attendees said every kid in this year's senior class at our high school seems to be going to college for STEM, bioengineering, chemistry, molecular, etc. Hey, Isaiah, do colleges still want humanities majors?
We do. And, I know that it might feel like, oh, there's no one applying to the humanities. But at a USC getting, 80,000, 83,000 applications, there's still going to be a good amount of fantastic students that are applying to the humanities. And you go through your territories and you say, oh, they are out there. I know it can feel sometimes like it's not, but they are still there, and we still do get a good amount of applications to humanities, enough to fill our classes. So we feel good.
So let me get in the mind of a parent of a teenager right now, and all I'm thinking is going, so is my student who's humanities oriented, do they have higher odds of being accepted? And if you're not comfortable answering that, we understand, but we have to know, Isaiah. If you're a Latin major, a classics major like Jim,
Yeah.
you have better odds these days?
At USC, it is a smaller department in the example of classics, right? It's a smaller department. End of the day, there's still going to be good classic, majors applying to that smaller department. I'll tell you that the difference in admit rate is so minuscule that, because again, going back to that main idea, well, I'll just apply classics and it's so minuscule, it actually does not make any sense to try and, game the system in that way. Also, most of our majors, our STEM-based majors, I'll say our Viterbi School of Engineering and our Marshall School of Business, your internal transfer process is not guaranteed. There is still an internal application process into both of those schools where you're going to be reviewed for, more often than not, the same things that you're going to be reviewed for. So it just furthers that point.
And I will say to USC's amazing credit, right? Love the question you guys ask, because I think the students who do try to inauthentically game the system and apply for that humanities major they think they have a best shot at, I always say, like, that quote unquote trick only works if it's authentic, right? And I think you guys as admissions officers you can suss out the BS pretty quickly. And that trick can backfire real fast if they don't think you're serious. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, yeah, that is accurate. And maybe it's more of the fact that that student that really is interested in classics in this example really shines because that authenticity.
That would be Jim, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the ACT and SAT. Love tutoring Latin even more, actually.
Yeah.
There you go. That's cool.
All right, we got a fun historical trivia question, so I'll take this one.
Like
Why do you think waitlist numbers are so much higher? And there's a very straightforward answer to this question, which is that there was an antitrust lawsuit filed by the Justice Department against the National Association of College Admissions Counseling in December of 2019 that NACAC had a rule that basically stated that colleges could not continue recruiting after their May 1st deadline. And that meant that wait lists were not that popular because no one was going to be accepted off a wait list very far after May 1st. But the Justice Department won their suit against NACAC, and NACAC had to remove that rule about recruiting after May 1st. So now colleges can recruit after May 1st, and it means that these long-lasting, longer wait lists are now a tool at their disposal, where before 2020, which would have been the first admission cycle that this rule was in place, the new version. So it was wrapped up in all the changes that COVID brought at the same time, just to make it extra confusing and difficult for everyone. It made it so that colleges approached this idea of wait lists completely differently than they had in the past.
Boy, the confluence of that and COVID is quite an exacerbation. I don't think I realized I understood that full history. And also, Jim, I thought the history you were going to nerd out about, one of your favorite things was the question. The number of students who will be in next year's seniors was said to be smaller and the beginning of the declining number of births. I remember the reports from my daughter was an infant. Are you seeing anything that reflects that? I mean, Jim, you love nerding out about this.
Yeah, so
to touch on this.
Sure. So we call this a demographic cliff, and basically it means that for the next, about 30 years, the number of 18-year-olds is going to be declining. It's at least projected to be that way. And so, the question becomes, same number of colleges, fewer butts to put in seats. Doesn't that mean that it's going to get way less competitive? Not necessarily. And not necessarily at the schools that our students tend to be most interested in. I say not necessarily because we're already starting to see some smaller private schools having to shut their doors. Cabrini University recently sold to Villanova, and we see this pattern in pretty much any period of economic uncertainty in the country. But it's going to happen now just because the market for them is actually shrinking. So will the kind of well-known schools actually get less competitive? Not necessarily. We'll start to see, the demand for the most in-demand product is not going to be as affected. But those schools who have more trouble attracting and recruiting students are really going to suffer as a result of this. Isaiah, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. We've already seen schools kind of move strategically in anticipation of this. The areas that the declines are going to be less intense, California, Texas, a lot of schools will have multiple regional admission counselors kind of there trying to get our. So, we know it's happening, it's going on. To your point, I wouldn't anticipate that a school like USC would be too affected.
But guys, it's the state of admissions. I'm just gonna push back, and Jim knows I often come into this with a bit of a skeptical attitude about how, and his responses are always good, but I'm I just gotta ask, in this venue, right? Is Cabrini getting bought out by Villanova? And is that, was it Marymount in New York getting bought out by Northeastern? Is that a product of this demographic shift, right? Or is it just a product of the TikTok shift where students don't want to go to those schools anymore, guys, right? Students would, who would go there would now sooner go to a very safe Big 10, Big 12 SEC school, and the numbers are just going in that direction. I mean, am I crazy? Is it both? Like,
Yeah, my belief, as with most things, there's so many different components that are going to affect these kind of outcomes that we're seeing. We can throw in rising, I would say faith in higher education across the board, rising cost of higher education. Many of those schools still come with a pretty big price tag, and folks trying to navigate that alongside economy and concerns, so all of those things I feel like just kind of create this perfect storm where some of these smaller schools are facing a little bit more financial stress. COVID was a really big impact for a lot of the smaller liberal arts schools and art schools and that kind of thing. So it's just like this my belief, perfect storm that we see these kind of closures.
all right, Isaiah, you're here. Jim and I answer this question all the time. We love that it's going to come from you, the answer. What do college rankings really tell us? Is there a resource you recommend to use for holistic college matching? No problem.
Okay, no, they they tell us not much, in my opinion. I think that when people kind of realize who ranks the other colleges, it kind of sheds some light on what these rankings mean. It's other colleges, it's folks at other colleges that rank the schools and popularity, right? There's a lot of talk now about draw rate and how you can get insight into again the popularity of the school, which might give a little bit more insight than rankings and such. I don't put too much stock in them. Most admission counselors don't put a lot of stock in them. Most folks that work in higher education don't put stock.
Hmm. Um, Isaiah, I have a thought on this, but I want to hear if people use AI to write essays, will it affect my chance, right? So, presumably a student's writing this in, concerned that if they play by the rules, they're going to get penalized by competitors who
Yeah,
don't.
this is a fun question because we train on this. And so in our reader trainings, we'll read a couple of essays, we'll talk about the essays, kind of different thoughts and perspectives on the essays. We've done this for the past 2 training cycles, and both times we've all come to the full consensus that the least compelling essay, we come to find out later, is the essay that was written by AI. So we don't know that that's the case or anything. Full consensus for admission professionals is difficult, right? And every time we're like, oh yeah, that's just really kind of sounded lifeless, and it didn't really feel compelling. To me, that's the best thing to think about when we think about AI writing essays. It's usually just going to result in a worse essay. It's just not going to be that good. As a student taking time, working on multiple different drafts, and getting edits and rewrites and working and getting feedback, it's just going to be better. And even students that rely on AI throughout their high school will likely just be less prepared writers when it comes time to sit down and do this type of writing. So in game, it never really benefits a student to rely so heavily on it. For success, it's you got to rely on getting better.
Yeah. Yeah, it was it's an impressive technology, but it was funny. I saw an adult um in my one of my social media circles go off on a rant about how every time she uses AI, she feels like it totally strips away her writing voice. And I think, there's that element, but ultimately at the end of the day, the best essays are the ones that are the most personal and personally insightful. Um, and AI can't inject details and reflections and insights. And it's great hearing that there's trainings on this and you guys can tell the difference. I mean, everyone who said it can tell the difference. I feel like our whole team can tell the difference too, right? It's instant. Um, Someone asked me the other day, they said, do any of your students use AI? I'm like, I don't know, but if they do, I'm going to tear that essay to shreds anyways. And trust
Yep.
me, anyone's not going to come up with the answers that are going to
Yeah.
satisfy me. So, no, none of my students
Yep.
ultimately, their essays aren't generated by AI because it can't be. Um, Jim, I think in the chat, there's one about homeschool, and then why don't we do the last one in Q&A? I think that'll
Sure.
round. Um,
Yeah, there's one other quick question about a technicality on test score stats that I can just answer very, very fast. Through the common data set or tools like Score or Naviance, if your school uses Naviance instead of Score, we can see the average SAT and ACT scores accepted. Is there a way to see the range or the median or the standard deviation? I wish is the answer. So in the common data set, the typical reporting is 25th and 75th percentile. Some people also voluntarily submit the median there, but that's not the kind of baseline requirement for the CDS. So sometimes you'll get the median in the common data set, but you're not going to find range or standard deviation. I mean, in Naviance or Score, when you're looking at the stats of your own high school, you can calculate the range yourself by just finding the lowest and the highest. Beware of the lowest because it's probably like a recruited athlete or something like that. I remember we had a running back go to UNC from my high school, and there was one score in the 900s, and everything else was over. At that time, it was 1300, and you could still actually get into UNC from Pennsylvania. So that beware of the range thing because you're going to see some weird stuff on the low end when it comes to athletic recruits and musicians and things like that. But yeah, I wish the data was better than that. The next question was about homeschool students. So you mentioned school profile. How do admissions offices view the school profile of homeschool students? If the student has high GPA with honors courses and high test score, are they at a disadvantage to a student from a known high school with the profile? And I would say I'll give our advice on this, and Isaiah, if you want to elaborate on it, feel free. Generally speaking, for homeschool students, standardized test scores are much more important. And that's because even with, I have a joke I like to say, like, if high school grades have inflated this much, imagine what's happened to mom's grades over that same time period. I'm, being kind of facetious, but the point is, it's less standardized. Grades are already not standardized when they're given by the public school system. They're even less standardized in a smaller setting like that. And so you're just going to generally have to rely more on strong test scores.
Yeah, and just we do have a homeschool liaison who works specifically with homeschool students, so I cannot give too much insight into the work that they do, but I think it is important to know that there is a singular person in our admission office that has a process outlined for students that apply as homeschool students. And usually, I would say, a lot of them apply with dual enrollment work and kind of something alongside that home transcript to give some insight. But Jim, you're absolutely right. I think for those students, test scores are oftentimes important to have.
And it's fairly common at some test optional universities for them not to be test optional for homeschool students as well. That's a policy that's very widely popular.
Yeah. So the last question of the night, Isaiah, if you feel comfortable saying anything, I think this is an appropriate way to end the night and looking forward in light of so many recent headlines, but also simultaneously with reinforcing our value system in the way that we support and advise students, right? And the question is this. I know this is anybody's guess, but do you have any wisdom you could share about the actions of the current administration, how the actions of the current administration will impact the viability of elite colleges and universities? Should we be worried about having a college admission revoked by a targeted school? How would you research the preparedness of different universities and colleges to stand these choppy waters? And I know we were talking about this earlier today, Jim, right, with regards to international applicants and, DI departments. I know you may want to touch on that, funding for research, the political and social landscapes. And, first of all, we want to just recognize and respect everyone in this audience and who's listening to this. Like, people are coming in with strong and diverse beliefs. about the past administration, this one, certainly the next administration. And what we would say, and I think the last component of this question is the one we would want to touch on most, right? How would you research essentially, like how does this influence our college search? Right? Because when we talk about what's in our control, right, in this process, there are a lot of things out of our control. Right now, we're seeing one set of headlines, but there could be any other number of geopolitical or social influence and changes that could be far more seismic in the past, in the future, right? We're only focusing on what's now because it's in front of us. And I think it's a good reminder to take a deep breath, take a step back and say, what's in your control? It is your grades. It is your test scores. It is your activities, your recommendation letters, and your essays and applications. But Jim, I think that's going to set you up well. And Isaiah, again, no pressure here. But we often joke internally about how there's this sixth factor in your control, not one that enhances your admission, odds of admission, but building your college list. And I mean, I thought about a lot today was our conversation this morning about how these are just good questions to ask universities and colleges when you're visiting about, what are their resources? How secure are those resources? And, what systems are in place to navigate, choppy waters. Jim, do you want to speak to this at all?
Yeah, and another one of the questions that we anticipated seeing a lot of was asking about how the current presidential administration's, their stance on DEI, how that would affect college admissions in the future. And the short answer is we don't know, and we don't have the crystal ball here. I can tell you just based on recent history. So the Supreme Court struck down the use of race in college admissions in no uncertain terms in their decision a couple years ago. And what happened as a result of that, colleges, they started to, instead of focusing on race as a factor in admissions, used a student's kind of background and identity and how that shaped their journey to who they are today as a factor in admissions. What that led to is, functionally speaking, the racial compositions of colleges not changing at all. So the Supreme Court said in no uncertain terms, you can't consider race anymore. In practical terms, there was no change, right? And I'm sure Isaiah could probably tell us there were changes in how they did things because they have to comply with new laws, right? But there was no practical change. That's not what I would have thought would have happened when I read that Supreme Court decision the morning that it came out. I thought it was going to be different than that. So I can't sit here and say now, like based on the first a couple months of a presidential administration, what's going to happen next? Because last time I was dead wrong. So that's the truth. We just have to wait and see, and none of us have a perfect crystal ball on this.
Yeah, and I'll just add, one of the things in my time at USC, there's a lot of things that happen in the world, and one of our professors in the Office of Religion once said, as an institution, we are never absolved from what happens outside of our campus. And that always stuck with me because, we exist in the world and there's big questions and there's changes and there's things, but we keep moving forward. If there's ever any concerns or things that people want to talk about, Eric, I'm glad you mentioned, always reach out to the institution and just talk to us. We want to help you in this process. That's why we're here. That's our goal. We're a great resource to get the information straight from the source. And that's what we want to do to make sure that, again, you have the questions that you need answered to help make the best decision for you and your family. So as things change, and they will always, right, know that you have someone that you can kind of reach out to, and it's just us.
And Isaiah, so often Jim and I are asked when students are going to go onto campus visits, hey, I want to ask my admissions officer a question or two. Something like this feels like a great question, but I'll end the night with a question about questions. So Isaiah, here's our last one of the night. You're the admissions officer answering questions. If a student is, wondering what questions to even ask, what would you tell them they should be asking you when they meet you at an admissions event or go on a campus tour?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I would say you take the time to think, what am I most excited about? Or what am I most worried about? Or what did I see on the website that led me here? Why am I visiting? What are those things that got me to book this trip to visit campus? So that could be a major, that could be an activity, that could be how's the food, that could be how's this city. What's it like moving from Seattle to Los Angeles? That could be, hey, I'm nervous about moving from a small town to a big city. Um, there's no such thing as a question that there's no dumb questions, right? Ask us if it's of concern, um, and we're really happy to help you out and get you those answers. Because genuinely, everyone that goes into admission goes into it because they care about students, and so you as a student know that and know that you can come to us with whatever you need. We'll be happy to answer it.
Not to be snarky, Isaiah, but you say there's no such thing as a dumb question. But if it easily could have been answered by Google, does that qualify as a dumb question?
Yeah, and I have been told I'm very nice. Sometimes I'm like, oh man, maybe you didn't know what to search. I don't know. I will tell you how the psychology program is. I got you. Yeah, if you can't find it online, but no, we're here.
Isaiah, if we can agree on nothing else coming out of tonight, you are incredibly nice and you have been incredibly gracious and kind with your time. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been truly a pleasure and a privilege to have you on. So
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation, and honestly, I'll look forward to it next year to see if I can come as a come as a attendee to hear about the state of admission. This is really fun.
yeah, well, thank you. And a huge thank you to everyone. Unbelievable audience. Who stuck with us the entire time. I mean, this is our flagship webinar for the year. You guys are incredible sticking through the whole time. You didn't even listen on time and a half on YouTube. You didn't wait for the recording to come out. We will be sending the recording out. We'll find ways to post clips, we hope, in the coming days too. But please, we will be posting this on our YouTube page, on our social media, emailing it to all registrants. Please pass this on to anyone and everyone you know. This was an amazing conversation, guys. Thank you so much for tonight. And Jim, do you have anything to add?
Go Phillies.
Yeah, hopefully we end up in there beating the Mets. Thank you to everyone who's coming. If you wake up tomorrow morning and realize you wanted to ask us a question, email us, call us, text us. We are here for you and your families and your students. It is our privilege and pleasure. Everyone have a wonderful evening.
Bye, everybody.